I want to ask Edie Friedman to start us off. Edie is founder and the executive director of the Jewish Council for Racial Equality, which we normally know as JCORE. She regularly speaks and writes on race and asylum issues, and she's authored and co-authored books and educational resources, and is looked to by much of the Jewish community for an authoritative voice on issues around migration. Edie.
Thank you very much, Mike. And if we could have the first slide up, please. So what I'm going to do very briefly this evening is to give you just a snapshot of the Nationality and Borders Bill, share with you some of concerns that we have, and say how JCORE and others within the Jewish community have responded, and also relate it to the situation facing refugees from Afghanistan and the Ukraine. And finally, to end up some suggestions of what we could do about the bill. Next slide, please. Right, so we know we have this legislation because Priti Patel and the government has told us that the asylum system is broken. And indeed, it has many, many problems, such as the lack of safe routes, such as the fact that over 600 children, young people live in unregulated hotels, that child refugees are left in hotels without shoes, without spare clothing, without accommodation, without health care, and a lone child goes missing from one of these unregulated hotels on average every week. Families as well are placed in dangerous accommodation, and we know the tragic death of a boy last year. And of course, there are long delays in dealing with asylum claims. Next slide, please. So the Borders Bill, as Micah said, outlines some very worrying proposals for so-called reform of the asylum system. And of course, many of us from minority communities, not only the Jewish community, are the children or grandchildren of refugees who would not been able to come to Britain if such legislation had been in place. And it is a very costly thing to implement. Estimates that it will cost £2.7 billion to actually implement. Next slide, please. So I just want to outline 6 reasons why we should oppose the bill. It creates a 2-tier asylum system. It ends the automatic right to claim asylum. It limits family reunion. It provides less protection for child refugees. It expands the asylum accommodation estate, and it punishes people who seek asylum and those who try to help them. Next slide, please. So our response, and others within the Jewish community, is we sent a petition to the Prime Minister. We've had many letters signed by rabbis from across the community. We've had letters signed by Jewish lawyers. We did a joint statement with the Board of Deputies, Rennie Kassan and World Jewish Relief, a letter published in The Guardian. We responded to the original consultation, which was a very complicated thing to do. We organized a panel discussion with Lord Elf Dubs and Andrew Solomon, the head of the Refugee Council. We've written to all Jewish parliamentarians in both the Commons and the Lords. And most recently, 40 rabbis signed a letter with over 1,000 faith leaders, which was sent to the Prime Minister. Next slide, please. So Operation Warm Welcome. So connected to all of this is the scheme that was announced in August to bring in people from Afghanistan. And there's supposed to be 2 schemes, the Afghan Relocation and Assistance, if we could go back, an assistance policy, and the Afghan Citizens Resettlement Scheme. And the first scheme, ARAP, was for people who had some connection with the British state. And the second scheme prioritizes, if it actually existed, those who stood up for democracy, women's rights, freedom of expression, and rule of law. And it was directed at extremely vulnerable people, such as women and girls. And that second scheme is supposed to have 3 pathways, but it hasn't actually been activated. Next slide, please. So how warm is Operation Warm Welcome? It's been estimated that about 13,000 people from Afghanistan have arrived from the first scheme. 5,000 people should have arrived from the second scheme before Christmas, which would be out of the 20,000 that Boris Johnson said we would be accepting. Now the 5,000 never arrived, and the 5,000 figure is going into part of the 13,000. So there's a lot of creative accounting going on. So there's real questions about what about those Afghans who have arrived across the channel through so-called irregular routes. People are put in quarantine for 10 days and then in bridging hotels, but great anxiety that some people will be there for up to a year, if not longer. Some people have found it such a stressful situation that they've actually asked to go back to Afghanistan. Huge mental health problems. It's been pretty much left to local authorities and private contractors to actually organize the resettlement. And there's been a lot of frustration and anger, even among some Tory MPs. Next slide, please. So JCORE has started to coordinate offers of practical support and goods. People may be aware that a synagogue in Bushi had a huge collection of clothing, and it was so successful they had to stop it before it finished. And then there's a logistical problem of how to sort the clothing, how to distribute it, etc. So we organized an emergency appeal because we said that money was more helpful than providing clothing. We had an open letter which we sent to Boris Johnson, signed by over 300 people, but there's real questions about what else we should be doing. Next slide, please. So we really need to act now for Afghan refugees, because one of the ramifications of the Ukraine situation is that the Afghan situation has been put even further on the back burner. So we are asking for some updates on what is happening to Afghan this scheme. Urgently, we're asking about what is happening to families who are moving out of these so-called bridging hotels. People need to know where they're going to go, whether it's the Outer Hebrides or Devon, Cornwall. People need help with employment. They need English classes. They need mental health support, and they need family reunion rights. Next slide, please.
2 minutes, please, Edie.
Right. So the situation with Ukrainian refugees, over 1.5 million have now left the Ukraine. It estimates there might be 7 million people who've left. 12 million people will need assistance within the Ukraine. And the Prime Minister has said we could take up to 200,000, but we really don't believe that. And Britain has been criticized for not having such as generous scheme as the EU has had. Next slide, please. So there are questions about what we could do within the Jewish community. Should we and how should we be using our own refugee experience as a basis of campaigning? How are we involved in rehabilitating the whole notion of asylum? And how do we also at the same time speak out about other issues such as inequality, racism, etc. Next slide, please. So our for us is that we need to amend the bill and certainly remove clause 11. We need to support Elf Dubs, who's asking for a resettlement target of 10,000 people. We need to back any amendments which would remove the bill's power to use offshore processing places such as Rwanda, and we have to make sure the military does not patrol the channel. And as we know, the House of Lords have backed and supported a number of amendments on child refugees, getting rid of clause level, asking that the UK government actually honor its commitment from the 1951 Refugee Convention. And next slide, please. And the next slide, please. So there was a lot for us. Unfortunately, the House of Lords have acted in a much more admirable way than the House of Commons. They have introduced and supported a number of very important amendments, which we need to reinforce. But we have one hell of a job, and we are part of a coalition of over 300 refugee and migrant organizations trying to defeat the bill. But it's a colossal task. Thank you very much.
Neera Yuval-Davis is Professor Emerita and Honorary Director of the Research Centre on Migration, Refugees and Belonging at the University of East London. She's active against racism and sexism in Israel and other settler and colonial societies, as well as in the UK. And Mira is also a member of the education group of Jewish Voice for Labour.
Thank you very much. I have only this one slide because there's so much to say in so little time, and I'm grateful to Edie that brought up some of the substantial issues that relate to the most recent bill. The name of the recent bill, I think, is very important because it's for the first time immigration legislation and nationality legislation are united together in the same bill officially, although this, of course, have been throughout the 20th and 21st century, at least, of British history. Theresa May invented the term hostile environment when she was interviewed in 2012. But of course, hostile environment towards migrant and immigration have existed a long time, formally since 1905 in an immigration legislation that was primarily addressed to poor Jewish migrants from Eastern Europe. I think we have three major nationality legislation that we need to look as an historical frame of in order to understand what is going on. We have the 1948 legislation in which Britain wanted to show that the British Empire covers the whole planet, and therefore it was a very inclusive legislation that basically, I think almost unintentionally, allowed all British subjects from the British Empire to come and settle in the UK, although, of course, they never intended it to be so. And Enoch Powell, who invited the people from Windrush to come and others to help the British state after post-World War, of course, also spoke the famous Rivers of Blood speech, if they actually will stay here. Then we had the 1981 Act, in which Britain rejected its imperial past and turned to become part of Europe. It was the first time in which British women get the same rights to transfer British citizenship to British men, but it is also the first time in which babies who are born on UK soil are not necessarily have the right to be British citizens. And now we have the present Nationality and Borders Bill, which is a post-Brexit bill, in which Britain go back to its glorious empire and reject the EU. So this is the most racialized, exclusive construction of who is the national we that has happened in British history, and therefore it becomes even harsher, more racialized and more exclusionary, although supposedly it's supposed to provide much more egalitarian treatment of migrants than before in all the migration history. In addition to the development over the years in which both, in addition to the Nationality Act, there have been a lot of migration acts that put more and more limitations of people to be able to legally immigrate to Britain. We also have a much more general crisis as a result of global neoliberalism crisis, which became very clear after the 2008 banking crisis, which some of us call the double crisis of governability and governmentality, in which governments stop more and more to present the interest of the citizen, and the citizen as in response became more and more distant and uninterested in politics, and of course, trusting in governments. As a result of that, we have a double process that reinforce each other. We have on the one hand a bottom-up process, which we call the rise of the extreme nativist right, which are trying to become more and more exclusionary to determine who is entitled for the shrinking collective resources of the state, with the prioritization of the state under neoliberalism and so forth. And then we have the top-down process, which some people are calling everyday bordering, that the government are trying to prove that actually they do have control of state and society. They do, they can protect the citizen. And we see the growing securitization of borders, and also we see the rise of everyday bordering as what we call the main technology of control of any kind of diversity and discourses of diversity, unlike multiculturalism, which was a hegemony way in which governments dealt with such a diversity in previous years. I don't have time to go into details about it. Hopefully, it will come in the discussion. However, what as a result of this rise of everyday bordering, we see the gradual phasing out of civil entitlements. This is not just because of every bordering, but of course also of neoliberalism, because the welfare state and become emptier and emptier with the years. But in relation to migrants,
2 minutes, please, Nira.
Okay, we see that people, migrants, lose the certainty that once they run the obstacle course that become more and more difficult, that actually at the end they will be able to settle and become and live here and become British citizen. Those who are already British citizens, refugees, that once was supposed to be the whole of one's life, is now at most very often just for very limited amount of years, or until their country of origin is so-called safe. But even people who are citizens and were born here and their parents are citizens, as we saw with the case of Shamina Begum, but also others, their citizenship is not secure. And Mike Cushman, who is chairing here, have written a very powerful piece which showed that all British Jews in principle are not safe of keeping their citizenship, because Israel has the law of return, which would offer them supposedly alternative citizenship. And at the same time, we see new citizenship duties emerging, in which people as employers, as landlords, as doctors, as bankers, as driving teachers and so on, and as well as in education, become unpaid, untrained border guards. And if they more than once are failing to identify so-called criminals who are fraudulent papers who are coming to work for them or live for them, they become criminal themselves and can even end up in prison. So what we see is that it doesn't, this process of hostile environment and everyday bordering doesn't only affect the migrants, although of course more and more what we call the gray zone, in which people are stuck on borders before crossing, after crossing, very often for the rest of their lives. And the conditions that Edie just described are probably the best of this condition. and very often are allowed to die, as we know. But it also affects the society as a whole. It divides society. It's often divide families when the employer is the employer of a family relative who came as a...
Ira, can I ask you to wind down now?
Yes. So what we see is that these exclusionary processes are intensified, but they are also very racialized. But we need to look at them in an intersectional way, because at the same time that they are racialized and exclusionary, people with money continue not to be able to move freely, but also to buy citizenships. Thank you.
Now, for our third speaker, it's Naomi Wimborne-Idrissi. Naomi is an old colleague of mine, not that old, but a long-standing colleague of mine. She was a founding member of Jewish Voice for Labour and is our media officer. And she's played a prominent part in anti-racist and Palestinian solidarity work for many years in her trade union, in the Labour Party, and in many other places, and is currently seeking to become a member of Labour Party National Executive Committee. And we are hoping that people will be nominating her in their constituencies. Naomi.
Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you everybody for attending. Thank you very much, Edie, for giving us the detail on this bill, which makes it utterly clear that it has to be opposed in its many ramifications. And thanks also to Neera for her devastating analysis of how the sort of web of racism is woven into our society. I mean, I read the paper that you sent us before, Neera, and the idea of bordering internally, of turning citizens into border guards within our society is quite a revelation, and it's obviously true and serious and horribly divisive. My aim is to look at the fight we have on our hands opposing a raft of racist repressive bills, including NABB, that the UK government is aiming to push through Parliament this year. So Shami Chakrabarti, for example, has argued that the government is resorting to a classic far-right playbook. It's proposing new police powers to crush dissent. It's rendering people whose ancestors came from other countries as second-class citizens. It's also trying to slip through a range of other anti-democratic measures, which are largely going by unnoticed. And I think it's part of our job to stop that being the case. Jeffrey Byman QC wrote very recently in the New Law Journal about Dominic Raab, the Justice Secretary, and his proposed moves on human rights. And Sir Jeffrey says that these are the latest installments of the government's authoritarian and xenophobic legal strategy. You know, he notes the moves to restrict judicial review, the right of protest and freedom of expression, and to extend the power to remove UK citizenship, which Edie's already outlined. These and other challenges to judicial safeguards and the rule of law were foreshadowed, Jeffrey Byman said, in the 2019 Conservative election manifesto, but I don't think many of us really noticed. He says that what we're dealing with is a government with an overarching aim of liberating itself from legal and constitutional restraints, especially those imposed by an independent judiciary. It sounds quite frightening, and it is. So we're looking at a raft of repressive laws. These are bills that reinforce attempts to undermine rights and liberties that are widely taken for granted in a liberal, quote, free society, and their full implications aren't visible immediately. They may not even become visible under this government, but they should be seen in the context of others that are already on the statute books and are having an effect. Like, I think lots of us have forgotten that we've already seen the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act, which went through last year, the CHIS legislation, March 2021. There's anti-trade union legislation that's been enforced since the 1980s. And there are other ongoing threats that affect us in JVL and the friends that we work with, the silencing of pro-Palestinian voices, largely through the imposition of the infamous IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and moves to criminalize boycott, divestment and sanctions as a means of supporting rights for Palestinian people. So I'm just going to do a very quick run through of some of the legislation that we're hearing about. So Nationality and Borders Bill, again, Edie's given us the detail, but some people have described this as Priti Patel's attempt to stop immigration. A very nasty bill. It seeks to criminalize asylum seekers based upon their means of arrival, as well as threatening the citizenship rights of an estimated 6 million already in this country. If the law comes into force, it stands to have a disproportionate impact on those born overseas or who have a parent born abroad. Its racist underpinnings are quite clear. It also targets migrants by giving border force officers powers to turn refugees away from the UK while at sea, and it makes it a criminal offence to knowingly arrive in the UK without permission. It's been condemned as in breach of human rights law. It creates a punitive, inhumane barriers to those who rightly deserve asylum, leaving them at the mercy of human traffickers. And all this serves to further entrench the environment that is hostile to migrants and to those with migrant backgrounds. So that one, as Edie said, there's been a lot of quite good work done in the Lords to try and ameliorate the worst effects of the bill, but it is still a heinous piece of legislation that needs opposing. Then there's the almost equally infamous Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill. It's been the target of Kill the Bill protests for many months now, and it's widely described as the bill that will, in effect, ban protest. Ami Chakrabarti, again commenting on this, says it represents the biggest step change in many years in criminalising peaceful protest. So that would mean if you wanted to protest against the Nationality and Borders Bill, you could find yourself prevented from doing so by the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Bill. As well as allowing for increased police powers around protest and criminal consequences for those taking part in peaceful demonstrations, it will make, this is a quote, residing or intending to reside on land without the permission of the owner or occupier a new criminal offence. And that's an explicit attack on Gypsy, Roma and traveller communities. The provisions in that bill extend existing police powers to place restrictions on protest if they are likely to cause serious disruption to the life of a community. So damaging property, making a noise, generally interfering with the normal way that things run could be criminalised. And again, there are attempts to ease the worst of these conditions, but it's a very frightening new law. So those two bills, Nationality and Borders Bill, Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Bill, have attracted the most vocal opposition, but there are others that deserve scrutiny. One of them is the Elections Bill, seen as a threat to the enfranchisement, particularly of minorities, because of the provision to demand personal ID to vote. The Online Safety Bill, which is in draft, it's meant to tackle the power of big tech. Some elements of it genuinely help combat online harms, but it also includes the threat to restrict the content, and who's going to decide that and what kind of content is likely to be outlawed is quite frightening. It's another potential threat to dissent, effectively. We also have the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, which, as Bindman noted, is an attempt by Dominic Raab to reform judicial review. In other words, to make it harder to get legal redress against actions of government and public bodies to which there is no other form of appeal. We've got Human Rights Act reform. It's Dominic Raab again, wanting to reform the Human Rights Act. He says to deny spurious human rights claims. Its main aim seems to be to allow the government to pick and choose who has access to human rights, specifically to block deportation targets, people earmarked for deportation, from successfully challenging attempts to remove them from the UK. There are other bills, including the higher education brackets freedom of speech bill, which, although it has a name that we would all applaud, freedom of speech, good thing, it's actually a means for the government to police behaviour on campuses of lecturers and students and visiting speakers. Very alarming. Health and social care bill, it's been described as a sort of private data grab, as well as offering provision for yet more privatisation and dismantling. So we've got to fight back against all these things. There is little sign of robust opposition across the board. We've seen some good stuff from organisations like Liberty, the Good Law Project. Some individuals in the House of Lords are waking up to the two top headline bills, NABB and PCSC. How do we develop sort of broad movement of defiance against all these threats to our liberties, and particularly to racialized communities? I'll stop there.